Good afternoon and welcome back. Thank you for coming back after lunch, and it's beautiful out there, so we do appreciate you joining us this afternoon. This afternoon's session is Art and Science Continuum, Optimizing Product and Service. I am Karen Fader, and this is David Gilmore, and our first speaker is Dr. Daphne James. She'll be speaking on educating medical imaging technologists, science versus art. Thank you. Welcome.
Hello everyone, and yes, thank you for coming in from the beautiful weather outside from lunch. It's been a lovely day. So I'd like to thank the organising committee for inviting me to speak today. And, oops, and I've touched the mice, I'm really sorry. I'll be in trouble. Already. So today I'm going to be talking about science versus art from the educational perspective. So how do we join the two and get that nexus of science versus art in nuclear medicine and medical imaging technology education? So, as you probably, most of you will know, that in Australia there are a number of programs at different universities teaching undergraduate courses in nuclear medicine, diagnostic radiography and radiation therapy. And currently there are 4 undergraduate programs in nuclear medicine. And they're all run slightly differently. They have different structures, they have different approaches to their teaching and learning. But the aim of all of those different programs is to train graduates that have the knowledge, skills and attributes of an entry-level practitioner. And the programs that we teach, the course materials that we are trying to get the students to learn, are all built on that foundation of basic science. And it's interwoven with those professional skills and attributes that you need to actually practice in nuclear medicine. So what is science? Lots of different, ways of defining what science is, but it could be described as a systematic body of knowledge which is universally accepted. And in general, science is based on experimentation. There is a theory. It is then put into some sort of an experiment to see if you can prove one way or the other. And that proof is then usually published in some form, usually in peer-reviewed journals. There should be universal application to that science, so it should be generalisable out to the general populations of whatever type of science that you're looking at. And it's very much an objective measure. So E equals MC squared, we all know. It never changes. It's the same. It doesn't matter where you're learning it, where you're putting it into practice. Same with the other types of science, maths, that sort of thing. In nuclear medicine, for science versus art, the science part is those basic sciences that we teach students very early through the program and then build on that knowledge and the application of that knowledge into practice. So they learn about physics, they do chemistry, anatomy and physiology, bioscience, looking at cell dynamics and all that sort of thing. Bit of statistics that nobody ever likes, but there's always some statistics in there, and increasingly some research training as well. So all evidence-based areas with concepts that the students need to learn and then be able to put into practice. And we rely as practitioners on that foundation of science to be able to go out into practice and perform the procedures that we do. But there are lots of very, subtle nuances and interpretations within the practice of nuclear medicine, and indeed most medicine, and that's where the art side of it comes into. And I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the areas that I believe that there's an art to our practice, and how the universities and the clinical setting can come together to help the students learn about that type of art using their science but being able to put it into practice. So what is art? Again, hard to define. Art is generally about practicing something. It's a creative endeavour. It's very personal. So what I think of as art, or good art, shall we say, or appreciate as well executed art, is very different to what every one of you would think of as art. And in general, it requires some form of technique. So if you want to learn the piano, you have to learn the notes, you have to learn how to play, and then you gradually get better and better with practice. But you also need to have some bit of talent there. You need to have that subtleness that you can appreciate the differences when you're learning to play an instrument or to do a painting or to do some sculpture or whatever type of art. And you also need to be able to appreciate those types of art from different aspects and different perspectives. So it's very individual and it's very subjective. And as you can see from music, beautiful sculpture that I think is beautiful, but a lot of you might look at it and go, yeah, not so fussed. And then we've got some really nice sort of urban artwork that some people really appreciate as beautiful art and other people think should be just, washed off as soon as possible. So just very, very individual, very subjective. So the art of medicine was a term that was coined BC, so centuries ago, that's what I'm trying to say. And it relates to the practice of medicine being an art. And it goes back, when you look back as far as Hippocrates, I knew I wouldn't be able to say that. In his very early papers, he wrote about the art of medicine and what that meant. And it was all about the humanity side of medicine and how medical doctors, back then they didn't have a lot of science to deal with, so it was all about that human side, and that was the part that they considered the art. And the science and the art in medicine go together a bit like the science of aeronautics and the art of flying. So if you want to learn how to fly a plane, you have to learn the physics of it. You have to learn how the plane stays up, your aerodynamics and all that sort of thing that I don't know about. But when you're actually flying a plane, when you're sitting in the controls at the front of the plane, it's very subtle about how much, push and again, I don't fly planes, so I don't really know, but, how much do I push the throttle? How much do I need to lift the front of the plane to keep it airborne? How am I going to land this thing, with wind shear and all those other factors that are very subtle, and that's where the art of flying comes in. Some people are good at it and some people aren't. Doesn't matter how much they practice. So practice doesn't necessarily mean that you will gain those skills and be able to do that art really well. We also talk in technology terms about state-of-the-art technology. So where's the art in the technology? What does that mean? And it usually means that it's cutting-edge science in our terms, If you go down to the industry displays and talk to them about their state-of-the-art new, PET scanners, what's state-of-the-art about it is the technology, it's the science, not so much, does it look pretty in your department? Got nothing to do with that. So teaching in higher education, it's very different to teaching, obviously, in schools, other areas. It's adult education, and traditionally it's been based on very didactic teaching methods. Most of you, when you've gone through your courses, you will have gone to lectures, you may have gone to some tutorials, and that may have been supplemented with some laboratory work to actually apply those principles that you've just learnt. And the students are then assessed on whether or not they have gained the understanding and met the learning objectives of that material. And they're looking at key concepts, knowledge of facts. So there's a lot of factual information that we need to learn to then be able to apply when we're doing our practice. And that application at university is generally in a very theoretical sense. So we talk about procedures, we talk about protocols, and then we assess the students on their knowledge of those things via exams, assignments. Most of you will remember having to do lovely written assignments and at midnight trying to finish them off. Presentations, standing up and talking to people, presenting your material in a clear and concise manner. But increasingly we're moving away from those types of particularly didactic teaching methods and moving into online interactions, simulated activities that are done on campus or in other settings, and virtual reality is really playing a part in medical and allied health education as well. So in general, most of the higher education that is done across the board in all sectors has a scaffolded approach to learning for those students. So we start off with a theory, we teach them the knowledge base, the facts. What do you need to know? A lot of that is the science, the basic underpinning. And then we move from that into simulation, where we try and show them how to apply that knowledge, how to start to develop some skills and technical ability. And we do that in a very supervised, very controlled environment so that the students are able to apply the knowledge, make mistakes, and it not have any detrimental sort of outcomes because you haven't just irradiated your patient 3 times as much as you should have. You've done something in a simulated environment and you're able to do that safely and repetitively. And that's a key. To be able to get some of these clinical skills and really learn them well, you need to do a lot of repetition, and they can do that in our simulation activity labs without, as I said, having to worry too much about patients and any adverse outcomes that may come from that. And then the third part of the learning is clinical practice and the application of that knowledge. And that's where you guys come in. We send our students to you. They're in a supervised environment, and our students should always be supervised at all times. And they're in the clinical setting, so they're working with those patients. They're hands-on, they're getting in with the radiation, they're applying all those principles that they've learnt. So just briefly, the MRPBA, you should all know, have their capabilities, professional capabilities documents. That document actually describes the profession-specific knowledge, skills and attributes of an entry-level practitioner. And so as universities providing education in medical imaging or medical technologies, we actually have to teach to these. So our graduates should have all of these attributes and knowledge. And there's 5 domains, as you can see here. And each of those domains are broken up into elements of practice that describe what we do. So it sort of is a scope of practice document in some respects. Some of those elements are really very specifically written and easy to define, easy for us to have the theory and then assess the students. So an example there, 5.1c, so that's under the practice of medical radiation science, is to identify anatomical structures and injuries, diseases, etc. So we can teach them that at university, we can give them some lectures, we can do some tutorials, and then we can assess them on their knowledge there. Some of the other ones are a little bit more subtle, a bit harder to define and definitely harder to teach and assess. And they're usually in those first 2 domains under professional conduct and communication and collaboration. So the example there, 2.1a, is about establishing a rapport with your patients. So how do I stand up in front of a group of students, undergraduate students, who have very limited experience working with patients and try and teach them how to build a rapport? It's very difficult, and some people are just naturally good at it and good at talking to people and good at interacting and have the right personal traits and and are able to pick up on those subtle cues from patients to know, when do I need to be comforting, when do I need to provide information, how am I going to deal with those patients. So it's a very subtle art in that respect. And we as in the universities, rely on the clinical placement setting for the students to be able to develop a lot of those communication, conduct, attribute skills. And we rely on you guys to assess them in the clinical setting. So we need to be giving you really good direction in that, and good explanations about, well, what are we looking for and how should you assess those. So back to the simulated learning activities, there's a whole variety of different areas that we can use simulated learning. And as I said, the students are able to do something in a supervised, very safe environment. They can do it repetitively so that they start to develop their skills and technique. And it's about preparing them for when they actually get out into that clinical setting on placement. So at university, we use it for radiopharmacy skill development, Venepuncture and cannulation skills, and also for communication skill development. And there's lots of ways of doing that. New technologies or new techniques that have come about very recently are things like virtual reality, as I mentioned before, and there's a thing called the Mask Ed Educator, and I'll talk about that in a moment. So if we just start off with the radiopharmacy skills, most of the universities have a radiopharmacy lab that students are able to go into and start to learn the techniques and the skills required to prepare and dispense radiopharmaceuticals. At University of Newcastle, we have quite a large teaching laboratory. Some of you will have spent some time in that laboratory. And the idea is that they can start to learn the procedures. Now you have to remember that these undergraduate students, the first time they open a packet with a needle and syringe, they have no idea what they're doing. Most of them have never held a needle and syringe in their life. They don't know anything about aseptic technique. They don't know how to open the packages safely, how to put things together. When you ask them to draw up even just saline from a plastic vial, they don't know how to do that. So if we can show them all of these very basic needle skills, handling skills whilst at university, then when they come out on placement, they're already able to start going, okay, I've got to use aseptic technique, I know how to do this, I know how to put the needle onto the end of the syringe and it's not going to pop off halfway through whatever I'm doing. Or it's a very difficult when they've never had to draw up a dose out of a vial which is encased in a tungsten or lead container, and they've got to tip it upside down and withdraw without being able to see what's in the vial. Things that we take as practitioners, qualified people, we take all of that for granted because you do it every day over. But the students, when they've never done it before, it's amazing to see them because they're just all, it's like they've got, 5 hands and they don't know where to put things and they don't know how to hold things. So being able to do it in the radiopharmacy lab allows them to make mistakes, and we usually start them off with no radiation because they spill it everywhere. And then we gradually introduce small amounts of radiation. But we're teaching them how to apply the radiation safety principles. So what they initially do is they're behind the L block and then they bring things out here and, they're waving their activity around. So keeping them in that safe environment, learning those skills. And we also teach them about doing QC procedures, being able to do that so that when they actually get out into practice, they already have a basic skill level. And some of them are better than others, obviously. Some of them spend more time in the lab. They're better at understanding that repetition means that they'll be able to do it. A lot of students think that I've done it once, I don't need to do it again. It's that, I've seen a bone scan, yeah, that'll do, I'm done. They don't get that understanding that it's repetitive. We need to do it, many, many times. And as a nuke med tech, how many bone scans have you done in your career? Hundreds, thousands, depends on how long you've been around. So being able to teach them radiopharmacy skills in that simulated environment is really important for them to develop those skills. And the art part there is that, how do I handle things? How do I know how far to hold the vial upside down? How do I know how to pull the plunger on the syringe without pulling it all the way out, which they do. So they're trying to draw out a dose out of a vial, and next thing they've pulled the plunger all the way out, and we've got, liquid going everywhere. So if they did that in a clinical environment with, 10 gigabecs or something like that, it's detrimental. Sorry, I'll try and speed up because otherwise I'll be here all day. Those of you that know me know well. So Venepuncture, again, we can teach them the anatomy. They learn this, they get diagrams, easy. We can show them diagrams again about where do we want the needle to be. When we inject into a patient, you've got to get it into the lumen of the vein, all of that sort of thing. But we can also use simulation activities, and we use mannequins like these to teach them. And again, they're not learning what does it feel like to stick a needle in someone and actually get it into a vein. They're learning, how do I handle a needle and syringe? Where do I put a tourniquet? Some of these students have never held a tourniquet. Most of them haven't. And we did a lab with some students the other day, and they didn't know how to put it on. And it was like, yeah, pull it tight. And they've pulled it, and, they're going, but there's no veins coming up, because they were just putting it on each other. Well, you haven't actually pulled it tight. And then others would pull it so tight that the person's, fingers were going numb. So the simulation activities help with some of the technical side of it, but there's still other areas that they need to learn in practice. And it's the things like, and you'll all know this, the art of finding veins in different types of patients, how deep to insert the needle, how tight to pull that tourniquet, how fast to push fluids through. If you've got 10 mils or 50 mils or just 0.2 of a mil. Pressure on the cannula, how to stop bleeding. The first time you put a cannula in and you take the stylus out and you end up with blood everywhere, how hard do you need that pressure to go there? Patients don't arrive like this, with nice labels for the students when they're learning. They arrive like this. And you might go, oh yeah, that looks pretty good, but then you've got to find a vein that's actually going to be viable. Well, they might be, they're lovely young chubby bubbies. We've got the old people that, as soon as you touch them, their skin falls apart, and the veins are all wobbling around the place. Bruising issues there. And this increasingly, more and more people having, full sleeve tattoos or tattoos all over the place that make it very difficult to actually find a vein sometimes. And sometimes if they've had poorly done tattoos, they can actually get micro scarring on that and on the surface, and that makes it very difficult to feel a vein. So the art of venipuncture is about it's not dependent on the scientific knowledge. It all comes back to those art areas, and it's not about experience or practice, because I'm sure many of you will have worked with people who have done many cannulations or venipunctures and are still not good at it. Some of us just have a knack and some don't. And that's the subtle part, the art part. And how do we teach that? We teach them the science, and then we role model the good practice, and that's what you guys do for us. Just moving on to, and I think I'm taking way too long, so sorry. I'll just jump through. So effective communication is the other part that I wanted to talk about. We have to have those graduate attributes, the domains of practice. We have to teach about effective communication. That's very difficult, and we do some simulation activities. And it's all about this art part with different types of patients. How do you talk to your patients? How do you communicate with patients, carers, the other staff that you need to deal with? You're informing them, you're questioning them, you're reassuring them, and there's subtle differences in all of those aspects. And, we can't do this. I'm just going to skip through here because I wanted to show you this. This is the mask ed. This is from CQU in Queensland. Anita Bowman is actually an ultrasonographer, and they get these masks made up. They're like they use in Hollywood in films. They cost a fortune. and they're really thick like a wetsuit material, and they put them on, and then they put their clothing on. So the old man and the old lady are actually some of their staff dressed up with these masks on, and then they go out, and the students don't know that they're the staff, and they're very, very lifelike. I don't know, I wouldn't be able to put it on my head, but and the students don't know, and they make them do scenarios with these patients for communication, and it works really well. And they have them walking around the departments at the university and getting the students to interact, and they make them, the cranky old man or the silly little old lady or those, so that they have a character. So it's a good way to teach that education. Virtual reality, we've got virtual Linux for RT. We can teach CT with that. It's excellent. They're trying to develop a nuke med one. I'm not sure. It's done in the UK, I think, so we're hoping that might come along. But all the universities in Australia have this for RT, and we can also use it for our CT. Nursing in Newcastle has a obstetrics one for virtual reality, and they also have these sorts of anatomy tables which are virtual reality too, that they can learn dissections on and other anatomical things. And I might just skip through. So I wanted to say clinical supervision, you all have to do that. You all have to assess students. Most experienced people will say, I just know when someone's right for nuke med. I just know. And it's like, well, how do you know? How can we tease that out? Is it the experience? Is it your gut feeling? Is it because we're all the same sort of people? Or, is Dennis Denuto? Anyone like the castle? That's the vibe. So that's all about assessing the science, but actually applying that art, and for people to be able to understand that. For you guys, we need to give you clear instructions on how to assess that. And I think most of the universities provide instructions, training, workshops on that sort of thing. So finally, you'll be pleased to hear, we need a balance of the science and the art to practice in our profession. It's really important to have that balance between science and technology and the professionalism and patient care. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. James. We will hold all the questions until the end of the session because I think some may overlap and we may get them answered at that level. As a reminder, you only need to scan the QR code once throughout the session, so if you've already done it, you don't need to scan that again. With it, and for everyone in the back, you know my famous saying, if you were in here yesterday, there's plenty of seats up front. Please move forward. Don't be like our students and just sit in the back, right? Next, we'd like to invite Dr. Jeffrey Curie to the podium to talk about the craft of medical radiation science.
Thank you, David. So I'm the gap filler. So when we looked at this session, is that we kind of figured we just needed something at the end, just so people didn't get to afternoon tea too early. But what I want to try to do is actually think about what Daphne sort of presented around, and those ideas around the art of our jobs and the science that Peter's introduced, and see where we sort of get the balance of those in our daily jobs. I'd like to thank me for inviting me to speak. So some of the context, we might actually have, people argue that the art of our jobs is gone, and we sort of talked about that a little bit at a conference last year, and sort of been overrun by the science because the technology's advanced so much. It doesn't matter what year you graduated, and I can see a few people in the room that graduated a few years ago. Probably didn't come to class, so it refers to Daphne's lecture. He was never in them, Harry. And a lot of people that graduated a long time ago and would have seen even more science, but everyone in the room would have seen changes in the time that they've been in their profession. And people say all the time that science is running away with it and we forget the art. And so some people are saying it's disappeared in favour of the science. And I don't think that's true. And when you look at the people that are drawn to a career in nuclear medicine, if it was just all science, you'd get bored. But there are some rapid changes, and we need to think about where those domains fit and how we get that balance. And so when we sort of break it down, is everyone has a different perception of what art and science is. But if we start to think about the science, we talk about that logic, that side of our brain where we have logic and analysis, and it links into how we communicate those things. And then on the other side, we've got this art, and it's all about intuition, how we think about those gut feelings that Daphne talked about. And creativity, you know, we tie it into creativity, but it doesn't have to be creative in the arty sort of, you know, painting kind of way. We're all creative in different ways. We have creative solutions. You can get someone who's very good at science, but they come up with a really creative solution for a problem. And so we don't need to pigeonhole creativity as being an art on its own. It's informed by science. And of course, emotions. You know, we all have our different emotions, and that impacts on how we interact and solve problems as well. And so if we define art, sort of art lies in that idea of intuition. It's informed by science. We can't get away from the fact that if good intuition and good art is informed by science and the education that you go through and the experiences, and that's what we focus most on, is that gut feeling is defined by experience, but it's not. It's a mix of that experience that you've got and the education, the science that goes with it. So just because you're a recent graduate doesn't mean that you can't have really strong intuition like someone that's been in the job for 20 years, because you're very well connected to your science and education. But it also changes with your mood. And I'm sure that everyone in the room has experienced, you know, times when just based on their mood, they problem solve or cause problems like myself, just based on their mood. So art also recognises that the end product or outcome is quite different between different events and patients. So we don't have to have one size fits all. And so the end point in art is defined by a sense that or a feeling that the task is done. It feels complete. We feel like we've done a good job. And it's not measured by something else. So it's all those warm, fuzzy feelings that, you know, we have from time to time. And so there's lots of examples. You know, patient communication, and Daphne gave some great examples around education, but the way that we communicate with people and teamwork. You know, you've sat in those team, you know, bonding sessions or you know, meetings, and sometimes just having duking it out is actually an art form in itself, and sometimes there might be a science to it as well. So conflict resolution and negotiation is a really powerful art form, and you'll know that you'll work with people who have this. They don't know how they solve these problems or how they're a really good manager, but they just do. It's just they just know people, and it's an art. So there's a big list of those kinds of things. But it also comes into our labs, so dose dispensing. Right? How many of you have worked with a technologist that's been around for a few years, and they just walk into the lab and they go, yeah, you've got to do up 0.3 mils. And they go, well, did you get a calculator? How do they know it's 0.3 mils? They just know. I don't know. It's just intuitive. Is that, you know, we just did that in the old days, and it's just a number that they just feel that based on previous experience and a bit of science that they're just putting at the back of their brain, they know the answer. And we saw that in radiography as well, where people just know, here comes a patient, based on their body habitus, these are the settings that we need to do. And we sort of fade away from a little bit of that because, you know, we can tweak our intensities and things like that. But I can see a few people in the room, I won't name names, David, Peter, Daphne, but who back in the day is that we didn't have computers that actually allowed us to adjust our dots. Our dots went straight onto a piece of film, photographic film. And if you got your intensities wrong or your timings wrong, you had to redo it. You had to present this film that could not be adjusted. You know, you put a big black cross on it. So that was an art form back then, and it's sort of been phased out, but there's other art forms that have come in. And so intuition is the art peculiar to the human mind of working out the correct answers from data that is, you know, in itself incomplete, corrupt, or even sometimes misleading. And so that sort of quote probably sums up some of those artful solutions that you've experienced in the workplace. So how many people work with someone who is a really good manager or conflict resolver, and they don't really know how they do it, they just do it. And some people have been promoted years gone by in a management positions. They don't have an MBA. It's just because they've got this art, this skill with people. So when you break it down, well, I break this down, I sort of thought, well, what is intuition? What are the factors that drive it? What is it that makes us feel right? It's things like sometimes it's our beliefs and values, sometimes it's our feelings and emotions, stresses and mood impacts on it. Really important one is your own experiences, your skills and knowledge, training, and of course your subconscious plays an important role. And when you mix all those things in, that's your intuition. And then one of those things changes, and of course you can get up with a different outcome, but you still feel good about it. And then we have science, and of course science tends to be informed by evidence, technology and defined protocols. The goal is to produce an endpoint that's reproducible. And so when we think about the endpoint, it's not what feels right, it's actually what worked. And so it worked, but you could actually have a really bad outcome. You could have a patient that didn't enjoy their journey or experience, but it worked. Or you might have a really bad day, but it worked. So, that's quite a bit different to art. And there's lots of examples around that. So, our defined protocols and procedures, the compliance requirements that we have to have either in research or clinical practice, business plans that are crafted and built, continuing professional developments built around those protocols, and risk management, which we all has emerged significantly in recent times. Risk management used to just be an art form. Now it's a science. Okay, and the calculations that we do, evidence-based practice, quality assurance, and all those sorts of things. So, just a little quote, I don't believe in science, I trust science. It doesn't have to be something that, we just know that it's there. We can have a bit of trust in it. You don't have to believe it. So using the same sort of format of what works, what drives logic, and obviously scientific evidence is a key part of it, your protocols and procedures, leadership and judgment, experience and skills, so some of these are in both logic as well as intuition, the data itself, okay, and so that's one of the flaws that can be introduced when you're given the wrong data or poor data. Understanding and knowledge, and of course policy. And so when we think about our job as technologists is that, and I had a editorial in the Canadian Journal that was on this topic, and this image comes from that article, that it's really, what we are is we're a mix, it's a craft. Okay, so when we think about what that word craft means is that, it's this balance, this continuum of art and science that we actually, it's constantly evolving and changing, but we have it in our everyday lives, and it's what defines us as a professional in medical radiation science. So if we get the balance right, it's not art or science, it's actually the craft of the two of them together. And so, we use the word craft quite often, and, it implies that combination of logic and intuition. You don't write a business plan. A good business plan is crafted. Okay, so it uses intuition as well as science. And magic is a craft, witchcraft, those sorts of things. And magic only works if the science and the entertainment side, the art side of it, work collectively. If you just gave you the science of art, of magic, everyone would be bored with the show. And then if you just did, the art, well, then there's no science, it doesn't work. So, so magic is one of those things. And so the duties of a medical radiation scientist, so our job demands a balance of the two. And more importantly than the balance, we need to exploit it. If you start to think about who gets promoted, who has the opportunities, who does a good job, all those things are the people who actually genuinely exploit both sides of that, the art and the science in doing the job that they have. So, so obviously, there's some people that like their little Harry Potter stuff, but I wish magic was real because science makes the world so boring. So you do need the art of it, otherwise it takes away the actual inspiration. And so Einstein sort of said the intuitive mind is sacred gift, and the rational mind is a faithful servant. And I think this is where we can get a little bit wrong sometimes. And the second part of it is that we've created a society that honours the servant and has forgotten the gift. And I think that we need to sort of look at the gift as much as the servant. If anyone looks at social media, when I pop on the odd comment, maybe once a month, it's like 10 a day, but Ernest Hemingway sort of said we're all apprentices in the craft where no one ever becomes the master. And I always thought that was a little bit funny because if you're an apprentice, you're actually an apprentice to a master. So if no one's the master, you can't be an apprentice. But anyway, that's the quote that he actually came up with. I just think it's a little wrong. But it's apt for today. So life's so short, the craft's so long to learn. And I think what we need to do is realise that you just can't come out of university or you spend a couple of years and all of a sudden expect to be a chief technologist or a manager somewhere. It's something that you've got to really craft and build over a long period of time. And sometimes opportunity just comes your way, and then other times it doesn't. It doesn't mean you haven't done a good job or that you're not moving in that direction, you've got to have a little bit of luck along your way. But it's not a short-term thing. You've got to invest a lot of time on both sides of that argument. And so sometimes people break the brain up into the left and the right, but you can sort of see here that if you start thinking about what is intuition, so your intuitive side of the brain, it tends to be a bit fast twitch. Lots of things happen in a fast sort of a way, which is why it's schematically represented as a hair. You know, a lot of things are reflex actions. You reflectively respond to something. And then the other side of it has a little bit more patience. There's a bit more tortoise in it. And you know, you're looking at reason and effect and those sorts of things. So we need to actually look at how it all intertwines. It's not one or the other. And Daphne had this picture up before, and I think what it symbolises is it's not all about maths and art. It's about how it all comes together and creates something that's really quite inspirational. They've used the word wonder, but that's what our job is if you think about how many times do you talk to people about your job in the street or patients, and they go, that's just amazing. It's amazing that you can do that, and it is. It creates wonder when we actually put those two things together. So how do we craft competence in our job? How do we craft that competence for ourselves? And we need to look at where that balance lies. We have this degree of predictability about things, and then this complexity, and our jobs and our lives and everything actually have the mix of the two. And so logic's sort of at one end of the scale. We tend to use logic when things are predictable, and we tend to use intuition when things are a bit more complex. And then we have this whole area in between. We have this whole area in between when we need to get the right balance and the mix of the two. And that's how we craft our competence in our jobs or in our lives and our relationships. So we move those two things together. If we work in logic alone, we have solutions. And if we work in intuition alone, we can have solutions, but they're very different. What we really need to do is create the magic of our jobs and the magic of our careers and the magic of our lives by crafting it all together. And so we need to bring those two parts of it together and get the optimal outcomes. So it not only works, but it feels right at the same time. And so I finished with this the last time in the journal article, and Arthur C. Clarke is quoted as saying that any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. And I think that, as I said, it's our job as medical radiation scientists to make that magic tangible to our patients. So that's where I wanted to end, and obviously if we've got time we'll have a little panel discussion with Daphne and Peter and see where you guys fit with the whole idea of art and science and the roles that you play. And so the last thing is, I just want you to keep in mind that, you know, people have different lenses. They look at life through different lenses. And this is sort of, you know, I saw this cartoon and it's like, well, can we add a little bit of colour to the scientists? Scientists are looked at as a bit of black and white, a bit of grey. And people see that as boring. But I just want to keep in the back of your mind that sometimes if this is the image, to a scientist, there's already colour there. Okay? It's not the colour you see, but it's still colour. And we need to appreciate that people have different ways of adding colour to things. So that's it for me. Thanks.
All right, so we do have some time for a panel discussion. Yeah, would you like to join the stage with us? So it's nice to have the distinguished educators of Australia all in one location. That's excellent. So I will start a question that I have. And that question is, as Peter talked about artificial intelligence and how that's changing the imaging world, and Daphne, you talked a lot about what we do as educators in the classroom and getting them ready for the clinical sites. And Jeff, understanding the craft, and that as technologists, every day we're doing the procedures that are here in front of us now and not the future. How does this all come together and begin to prepare the next entry-level technologist? Because that is changing on a daily basis. And yet, not as fast as we think it does in the clinical setting.
I think that's not a bad question to start with, and I'll throw it to Peter. No.
I'm happy to have a go.
Yeah, is it? I think it comes back to, for those that were at Brian Smith's presentation, which seemed to be a little bit about the stars, and I think that's what you're talking about. Is it some of the stuff that Peter was talking about is about the stars, and what Daphne was talking about is recognising your feet are still on Earth when you're looking at the stars. And he sort of finished with the idea of, how do we actually respond to I guess, an environment that's actually moving with not only the tides, but, changing, in where it is in general. And he used the word agility. And I think that when we look at the courses that we develop, and I know Newcastle does and CSU does and Sydney certainly will, is that, what we look at is, and we've been very good in nuclear medicine being agile and a little bit liquid and fluid in the way that we respond to things. So when things change, our students are actually well enough educated that they can actually respond and adapt to that environment. They're agile when they go into the workplace. And if things don't go that way, they can use that same set of skills and knowledge to adapt to what does emerge in that environment. So I think it's agility.
Mm. And I think it's a little bit, if you look back, for those of us who are old enough, at what nuclear medicine used to be, there's a lot that's still the same. So the grounded part, a lot of our practice has not changed a great deal, and certainly some of the elements where the art part, so, we still all have to do Venepuncture, we still all have to get that communication and rapport with our patients, we need to be able to communicate with the other health professionals around us. That's often a forgotten part of the communication skills development. So we focus on how do I deal with my patient, but how are you dealing with, your referring physicians or the other people, the nurses, the doctors, etc. that you're dealing with. And none of that has really changed over the last 30 years. The technology, the science changes all the time. We always talk about our rapidly developing technologies and how we have to keep up to date with that. And we all come to our conferences and we love to hear about, the new types of technologies, the new radiopharmaceuticals. I think, was it Fridays? The Rad Farm on Friday. One of the things that I found really interesting was, they're talking about using technetium-labelled PYP to do cardiac amyloid. And those of us in the room old enough are going, no, I remember doing hotspots. Same thing. So it's like the science is actually pretty much the same as it used to be. It hasn't changed, but the application changed. So it's sort of same but different. So it's sort of keeping that one part of it that is very grounded, but also having the new things. And the artificial intelligence is obviously something that's infiltrating science and medical science, and it's certainly going to impact on the way we practice. Yeah.
And the take-home message I got from Peter's discussion on artificial intelligence, just to reassure the people in the room, is that it'll actually be used to help us do our job, and anyone that's going to be put out of a job will be the doctors, not us. Right?
Yeah, well, I think the doctors have to think of a new way of doing things. There may be some basic diagnostic tests that are replaced, but they may become people who are more about translational type medicine rather than doing the repeat diagnosis they've done time and time. And these will be digital assistants. They're going to give them confidence, increased confidence in the diagnosis that they make as well. I guess in answer to your question, David, I was thinking that a lot of these things are a bit like the field of dreams where, you build it and they will come. So the engineers have these great ideas of putting together a PET system and an MR, but they put it together, but they haven't actually had a chance to put it in the clinic and see where it's going to do the best job. Where is it going to provide the best clinical diagnosis? So what I see our role is, what is our expertise? What do we do well? Well, we're the ones that implement the protocols. We're the ones that interact with the patients. We look after workflow. So what is it when these technologies come into our department that we can do in a scientific way, developing new knowledge and evidence that will improve the patient experience, improve the quality of the images, and maybe make things a little bit more efficient and more comfortable for the patients. So we need to think about what is our skill set and what can we add to the field with the skills that we have.
No, that's great. All right, do we have questions from the audience? Because, see, the unfortunate thing is, for all of you, we're all educators, so we can just stand here and ask questions all day long and just be theory-based in things. But what questions might you guys have?
Okay.
Yep.
Hi, just got a question about what you talk about art and science and what you think about more of the fluidity between them, that science gets taught at uni and art gets taught in the departments, though what I've found with when you start getting quite regimented in how things are taught and what you do, students are going to have a not as good an outcome in a clinical environment. The times where we've had students come and say didn't have a great time at the last placement was when you have educators saying, we do it this way and that's the way you do it. Whereas I know in my practice I try and promote the text to push that, and especially in things like lab, that we make sure the students get to see lab with multiple texts, and it is about working out how to do it your way, not necessarily this is the way to do it. And so I guess what I'm asking you as educators, do you see that there is a more of a fluid line, that it's not just black and white on it for these type of things?
Yeah, and it should be. It should be liquid at uni as well as on the clinical side. So you sort of said that, it's a bit more science at university and a bit more of the, art on site, and it shouldn't be that way. It should be all at both sites. And I think that we work very hard at my university to ensure that the students actually, we talk about the curriculum and we talk about the hidden curriculum. And so it's about leadership in both of those, and even within the actual defined curriculum, you actually have the art side of it. We're talking about those simulations, about giving those students the communication skills and those intuitive skills around the science as well, that they actually pick up in the university environment. When they come out on placement, we expect to have the science reinforced, and then we expect them to pick up those arty skills as well. So it's got to be fluid. It's got to be a mix. And I don't think it should be defined. And certainly when we teach the students, this is the theoretical best protocol, they at the same time they are taught that, but when you go in clinical practice, you can have 10 sites that do it 10 different ways.
And I think I do the same at Newcastle, and most of us do, that when you're teaching something, you're teaching them the textbook, the guidelines, the procedure that has been defined, but on the back of that, we're always saying, well, this is that guideline, but you need to be able to adapt and modify that to your individual patient presentation or your individual department. And as Jeff said, we all know everyone can do a bone scan, but does everyone do it the same? And I can remember being at TAFE years and years ago learning, and I think it was Brian Hutton, some of you will remember Brian, was like, how do you do a bone scan? And everyone in the room was giving different answers, and he just kept saying, how do you do a bone scan? Because although the science behind it is the same, everyone does do it slightly different. And I think, and I hope I didn't give the impression in my talk that science is at uni and art is in practice. There's definitely a combination of both in both settings, and some of those subtle arts are just something that, we can't really, we can help them start to learn techniques and the background, but to get out in practice and be able to, be doing it within that clinical setting is really important. And they need to know, and I would hope that students these days don't come out and say, oh, well, such and such did it that way, and why, you're doing it wrong, because we do try and let them know that it is, a procedure that can be done in different ways, and you have to adapt that to whichever clinical setting you're in at the time.
I think students want to be shown some respect and have a conversation about why things are done a certain way. There's nothing to shut down enthusiasm more quickly than to say, this is the way we do it and you will do it this way when you're here, and just don't question it. Mm. If it's a conversation about this is why we do it here, and I'd be interested to hear about your other experiences, and then I think the student has a completely different experience to that. And the other thing I was going to say was, I remember from all those years of marking exams, I always had to keep a really broad, open mind, knowing that the students are out there doing so many different protocols in different ways, and there was not just one right answer, there was a correct answer based on certain principles.
And I think some students are not very tactful, so when they get out in the setting and they're like, oh, well, such and such, as I said before, they did it this way. And I always say to the students, if you want to ask, someone who is very experienced, you're the inexperienced person, if you want them to explain, as Pete said, why they're doing it that way, you actually have to ask in a really the appropriate manner. And if they get your back up to start with because they've asked and sort of said, well, that's not the way you do it, or that's not the way they told us at uni, that puts you on the back foot. So it's about communication. Always comes back to communication.
Well done.
Sort of off the back of that, those intangible things, there's hundreds of us out there, and you have students that have good experiences at one place and the culture is bad and you go somewhere else. What's your feeling about assessment tools? Because regulators want boxes ticked and assessment tools to prove that this person has these skills and these attributes. How do you feel, given the number of us with all that information assessing these things, how do you design assessments that pick up those intangibles to the satisfaction of university boards or regulators and people like that? Because we've gone from having 5-point assessment things and boxes to tick over education and assessment. So what's your feeling going forward about being able to assess these intangible attributes?
Did everyone hear the question? Okay, all right, thanks.
Well, I guess my point of view is I think it would be really nice, as I showed before, the MRPB has set up those professional capabilities for us, essentially. So I think what we need to do at the universities is to create some sort of assessment tool that reflects those capabilities and the elements of practice within them. It's very difficult, and I always say this to students, clinical assessment is always going to be a subjective measure because, what one practitioner thinks a student's done well at, and one practitioner might mark very highly, and we have this, students go, oh, well, if I go to that department, I'll get all, well expected or high marks. And if I go there, well, I'll do the same, but they'll only give me midway because they don't think anybody can get there. So it's about the interpretation of the assessment tool. And I think, although it is always going to be subjective, I think it's our responsibility to train our supervisors into what or how we want that assessment tool used. And I guess that comes back to workshop scenario-based things and, yeah.
And we've been through this transition from accreditation with the ANZSNM to ARPA registration, and it's been actually a liquid environment. So it's only just really starting to settle, and I can tell you from a university perspective, I'm sure Daphne will agree, it's actually been very difficult for us to actually work out what the evidence is that the actual ARPA want. And so we have to show, so against all the domains that Daphne talked about, and each of those has subdomains which has sub-subdomains, right? So there's a whole bunch of them, and it literally defines our scope of practice. And it says that you need to be able to demonstrate that the students have this capability. And then they say to us, how can you show us that your students have that capability? And a lot of it actually comes back to the evidence that comes from clinical practice. So the difficult situation that we're in, and I did do this at a conference at Rains last year, is I actually asked the audience, how many people in the audience have actually read the domains and know what's in the domains? So I'll ask the audience, how many people in the audience have actually read ARPA's domains for the scope of practice that defines the jobs that you guys do? Right? And so there's a few people, so more people haven't than people that have. But that's those ARPA domains. When you actually re-register each year, you're actually confirming to ARPA that you can satisfy all those domains yourself. Okay, but most people don't even know what those domains are because it's relatively new and we haven't made that change yet. So now we have, so we had no one in the room, apart from the academics in the room. At the last conference, I had nobody that actually had seen the domains, but they're asking the universities about why we're making assessment so hard. And what we're saying is that you need to be signing off that the students have these capabilities. And that's part of the evidence that we provide to the universities. So, to ARPA, and we have to do it. So, as Daphne said, it's about education. So people need to be familiar with what they are and what the tools are. And in the end, it comes back to professionalism. Is that we need to be moving away from maybe in early years we can actually have the above expected, well above expected, below expected, and it's all airy-fairy, fluffy stuff. But when it comes down to signing off someone in a 4-year degree that they're actually capable and ready to be a qualified practitioner and fully registered with ARPA, then we need to take as practitioners, we need to be very serious about it and say, if I tick this box, I'm saying they're capable to do the job, and if they're not, and so we're dishonest about that, well then we're actually devaluing our own profession. We're introducing someone in the profession that could harm themselves, harm staff, or harm patients. And so we need to educate people about what they need to do, and at the same time, make people realise that this isn't just signing someone off at school, at end of university to go into their PDY. It's actually saying that they're ready for full registration, and we need to actually just have that level of professionalism.
Yeah, just to build on what both Daphne and Jeff have said, I think the key point is that to make sure we're all on the same page just takes a lot of conversations about what the standards are and what the goals are. It's just an ongoing conversation between those clinical supervisors, the university. It just continues. You can't say I've done it and that's enough. The conversation goes on until we continually have a good understanding of what the actual levels are. And it's that challenging part too. You know, often when we get an assignment, we can receive the assignment in the way that we don't know who submitted it or an exam paper. But when someone's been assessed in a clinical placement, they've got all their personality that comes with them. So can we shut off our opinion about their personality and how they fit in that department and objectively look at their capabilities? And that, as humans, that's a challenging thing to do. So it's being objective, but also keeping conversations going between everyone so that we know what the standards are.
Yeah, I think along that line, with the students, I know students put clinical supervisors sometimes in a very difficult position, because if they get a poor report, then the students are not backwards in coming forwards, and they'll come and get upset, and you know, you go through the gamut of emotions of the student who cries, the one who gets angry, the one who, you know, throws things and leaves the department, and you guys have to deal with that at the time. But you know, as Pete said, it's that personality that comes into it, and sometimes the students, I know, do put pressure on people, the supervisors, that, oh, if you don't pass me, I'm going to fail, and then, you know, that's going to cost me more money because I can't progress at uni and that sort of thing. So there's a lot of dynamics going on there. And I think, just finally, the other thing that I think will be magnificent is that there's only currently 4 universities doing nuke med, soon to be maybe 5. We should be able to get together possibly and look at a universal, well, not universal, but Australia-wide marking criteria to be used. I think that would take a lot of the, I don't know, difficulties, guesswork, whatever, because if all the universities have different assessment tools, then you've got to, you know, change your assessment for each one. But if we're all using the same tool, then I think that would go a long way to helping supervisors.
And the tool's going to be different from signing off at the end to say you're fully registered versus you're completing those competency, the old style. And I think that there's a big change, and I don't know whether when you're doing it concurrently, that sort of starts off with one model and changes to another. But it's a way of changing completely how we think about it, because students do think it's a pass or fail. And then you know, supervisors think they're either passing or failing. And when you're actually looking at those ARPA capabilities, it's not pass or fail. It's not that at all, and the mentality should not be pass or fail. It should be that you meet a minimum standard, and someone might meet that standard early and others will meet it later. So I have students on 4th year placement that have been out for 4 weeks or 5 weeks who are being signed off as meeting the standard. And I know they haven't met the standard. It's like, but they feel like, oh, we've got to let them meet the standard of something. They may not meet the standard for 6 months of clinical placement, and that's okay because it takes that long to train. And so we have to re-educate clinical supervisors to say it's not pass or fail. And of course the students need to know it's not about pass or fail. It's about their journey. Everyone moves a little bit faster in some areas and slower in others. It'll depend on what the clinical workflow is. And you know, now that we're a little bit stationary with ARPA, it's time that we actually educated, you know, the clinical supervisors the same way and take the pressure off, you know, for the crying students.
But also, I mean, in radiation therapy, sorry, I'll be quick. Radiation therapy have had an Australia-wide assessment tool for a number of years now. So they have a clinical educators network within radiation therapy, and that's worked very well for them. They're having to change that because they also have capabilities that they have to make the same as us. So I think there's a time possibly coming that, you know, we all know each other really well, so we should be able to work together to maybe get something. Yeah.
There was a question in the audience.
So I've got a question. It's not about the assessment, but before that, about the teaching. So the modern student learns to communicate very differently to someone of a couple of generations ago. So has the teaching actually evolved to adapt to that?
I think that there's a whole bunch of stuff to unpack there.
Yeah.
My question is because we get students and interns coming through more from levels from first year through to intern year, and I'm hearing really different feedbacks. In case of, okay, we were told if you ask them a question, instead of going to a textbook because they don't have one, they go to Dr. Google, and then the answer's not there, then I don't understand how a textbook would have the answer.
Yeah, no, if I had one of my students that was referring to Google instead of actual real literature, is that they probably wouldn't graduate. I'd find a way to make sure that did not happen. But I think that one of the things that's really important to realise is that there are pressures to have changed. You know, it's the same as health. You know, we used to have a delegated decision-making model in health where patients were just there as patients. They did what we told them. We could be grumpy with them. We didn't have to communicate with them. They just said, you lay on the bed and keep still, and they laid on the bed and keep still. Well, now they're empowered and they have rights, and we've got to respect those rights. And, you know, if they cry, we've got to give them a tissue and all those sorts of things. So, and students are the same. Is that we don't now, the students are empowered. It's not this relationship where the professor talks down to the student and we say jump, they say how high. Now, the students are empowered, and if they don't get what they want, you know, they complain, and then you get in trouble, and so all of a sudden you have this highly empowered student. And I think it's probably some ways gone too far the other way. They should be empowered, but it needs to be a relationship. And so what happens is that you still get students who feel like the world owes them something. And so they don't feel like they should have to do any research. It should be just given to them. And that, you know, when they come out of the workforce, then, or on a clinical placement, then they're a little bit the same. They want you to spoon feed everything into them. And that's not what the university's policy is. That's not what we want. At the same time, we've got economic pressures that are built around flexible learning and doing things by distance or in flexible mode and all those other things that change the way the student learns. But in the end, the expectations are as high today as they were yesterday, a year ago and 10 years ago. The way that they deliver is a little bit different. But if students are trying to pull the wool over your eyes, we are dealing with a different generation of people, and their expectations around life and how they manoeuvre themselves through life is a little bit different. And I find that challenging, don't I, Harry? And and it's something that clinically that you guys would find challenging too, whether it's students from our university or patients or, you know, or other people, because it's not just something.
Because you mentioned the assessment, how it needs to be objective, not just subjective. But if you're talking about dealing with people and communication, it's like, well, yes, they can know how the technicalities of acquiring a bone scan, but they actually can't deal with the patient, actually making patients depressed afterwards, or feeling worse. I find that's something we need to barely assess.
Well, that is assessed now. So this is a really important part of ARCRA's capabilities, is that you can't just be good at, you know, domain 5. You've got to be good at, you've got to be able to capable in domain 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 as well. And so that is part of that assessment now. And even and so certainly, you know, before they, you know, become graduates, but even in first and third year now is that, you know, that's an important part of the marking rubric that the students actually demonstrate those capabilities, not just that they know how to do it, but they actually do it in a professional way. The professionalism is as important as the safety side of things and getting it done.
And I'll just briefly say, your first question about, you know, textbooks and so forth, one of the biggest issues we have is getting students to class these days. Students don't attend lectures anymore because they're recorded and they're provided for them online. My first years, I say to them, now if you come down the corridor here, there's a really big room and it's full of books. And if you go and have a look in some of those books, you can actually read about the techniques that you're going to be doing, because they don't go to the library except to use the computer, because they've been brought up through schooling now and just through life that they expect to be able to get everything they want off their device. So that's a real challenge for us as educators, to engage them with the materials when we can't engage with them face-to-face anymore. It's a big problem. Yeah.
I had the horror of having a teenage child go to university and not go to lectures, and it took me a while to come to terms with that, but they really do have good access to materials now, so things are recorded, so it's sort of an expectation that's going to occur. But people do still go to tutorials, things that are high contact and face-to-face, that's still highly valued, and students are there engaging in those processes. A lot of the textbooks now, libraries are now buying online versions. So it's not the same financial commitment they used to have. They can, while they're a student, they can access good quality text by well-regarded authors in that way. And with distance education, I mean, we did it since the mid-90s, and for many years, we were sending out packets of learning materials that people read and then mailed their materials back in. But it's all changed now. We have webinars, we have online discussions, we provide them with all the digital materials to support that learning, and we try to engage them in a way that they would have in the classroom if they attended. So the expectations change. I'm not sure how that translates into the clinical placement, but they're the sort of things that we're trying to deal with the new generation of learners.
And even within that environment, it's about value adding. So this is being recorded, right? So I suspect at some stage that people can actually, instead of coming to the conference, buy all the presentations and listen to them. And it's been that way for the Society of Nuclear Medicine meeting for many years. But people still go, and there's a reason to go. And there's a reason that you guys are in the room. Is it because there's something value added that you get that you're not going to get just from listening to the recording? It's whether it's the networking with the people in the room, or some subtlety that comes from the discussion that's not recorded, or the body language that goes with it. And so when you teach, and I don't know whether I'm successful or I'm not successful, but one of the things that I try to do is actually value add in my classes. So I actually I have high attendance, and the reason that there's high attendance is because students, I presume, are either scared of failing through me being vindictive, or that it's because there's something that's value added. And so that they come to class and there's something extra that they wouldn't have got. And it's the same in clinical, is that, you want to engage students in a way that is going to be productive for you and value add to you, but value adds back, and then they're more engaging as well. But it is a generational thing, and it's a challenge about how we engage them. They have a completely different learning style, and some of it you've got to break, and some of it you've got to just be malleable to.
Embrace.
Okay. I would just, something I didn't mention up front is that I'm an educator from Canada, and David is an educator from the United States. And what I'd like to say is that we share the same challenges and joys in teaching the next cohort of nuclear medicine technologists. Thank you all for a great session, very informative, very interesting. Thank you.